Good evening. My name is Georgia Schaefer-Brown, and I'm a student co-supervisor and project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to recognize that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We hereby recognize the prior status and enduring diversity of this land and the many indigenous nations that stand in relation to it, particularly the thousands of indigenous children from dozens of tribes forced into the reprogramming camp established at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879. Dickinson College supported this agenda of cultural eradication in both word and deed. Turning honestly toward that shameful past animates this acknowledgement and gives orientation to our desire for a reconciled future. Accordingly, this living land acknowledgement is intentionally incomplete, a reflection of the ongoing process it represents. To learn respectfully from the stories of this land and the peoples that carry them. To think reflectively about the injustice in our shared past, and to act responsibly with that knowledge today to inspire a more equitable tomorrow. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Bechtel Lectureship Fund, and the Departments of International Studies and Economics, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Boosting Human Capital in Africa, Why It's Needed and How to Get It Done. The Bechtel Lectureship Fund was established to support Clark Forum programs regarding Africa, in honor of Emeriti faculty Joan Bechtel, who served Dickinson from 1971 to 1995 in library resources, and the late Dan R. Bechtel, who served Dickinson from 1964 to 1995 in the religion department. Their son, Peter, is a Dickinson graduate who has been working in Southern Africa for more than 30 years, opening national parks in Mozambique with the goal of preserving the livelihoods of the residents as well as the flora and fauna. This lecture is made possible with the support of the Bechtel family. As an international studies major, I was first exposed to the academic side of international development through my courses at Dickinson, courses which sparked my interest and pushed me to pursue a semester-long study abroad program in Yaoundé, Cameroon. This program focused on development and social change through a lens of decolonization and allowed me to connect with individuals who had been personally affected by development initiatives, either positively or negatively. Through these conversations, I learned the importance of centering the needs and priorities of people and communities in development work. This focus often happened through learning about initiatives in education, health, or job skills. Tonight, Dr. Dupas will discuss the necessity and feasibility of boosting human capital in countries across Africa. Dr. Pascaline Dupas is a professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University. She has also served as the Kleinheinz Family Professor of International Studies at Stanford University. As a development economist, Dupas studies the challenges facing poor households in lower-income countries and their root causes in order to identify interventions and policies to reduce global poverty. She conducts extensive fieldwork, and her ongoing research includes studies on education policy in Ghana and family planning policy in Burkina Faso. Dupas is the co-president of the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis of Development, a board member and affiliate of the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and a research associate at the National Bureau for Economic Research. In 2013, she received a National Science Foundation Career Award bestowed by the U.S. government in recognition of her independent research career, as well as the Best Young French Economist Prize in 2015. Dupas is a fellow of the Econometric Society, a former Sloan Fellow, and a former Guggenheim Fellow. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion, expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. In the event of an emergency, note that accessible exits are located on the west side of this building, behind the projection screen. At this time, I ask that you silence all cell phones and electronic devices. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Pascaline Dupas.
All right. Thank you so much for this all too kind introduction. That makes me feel kind of old. But it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for giving me the honor to share with you some thoughts about this very important topic and this very important and large and heterogeneous continent that is actually subcontinent Sub-Saharan Africa. And just in case you're wondering what this beautiful piece of art is, this is by the Ghanaian artist Elena Tsui. This is a massive piece that was hanging in the Zeitz Moka Museum of Contemporary Art in Cape Town, and I encourage you to learn about this artist. All right, so as Georgia mentioned, I'm a development economist. What do development economists do? We try to understand better what are the bottlenecks and the opportunities when it comes to global development, and our goal is to improve the lives of people who live in poverty around the world. And Sub-Saharan Africa is the continent with the largest share of extreme poor, so it's an important geographical area of focus, as you know. And in particular, over time, it's going to become even more the center of poverty due to some extent, good news, which is that many people, in other parts of the world have been lifted out of poverty. There's been a massive decline over time, as these graphs show, in the global population share living in extreme poverty. But the decline has been less pronounced in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so, as of 2022, it's maybe 80% of the world poor are in Sub-Saharan Africa, and by 2030, it may be 90%. So, given the importance of this area to make progress, the next step of progress on eradicating global poverty, I want to first share a few facts about the subcontinent. So it's still an area where agriculture is playing a prominent role. So this map shows you the share of people around the world that are employed in agriculture. And as you can see, Sub-Saharan Africa stands out as being a relatively large, much larger share of the population in agriculture than other countries. It's also an extremely young continent with a median age of 18. So median age means the age at which you have half of the population below that and half above. And so half of the population in Africa is below 18, in sharp contrast with much of the rest of the world. So this young population is a great opportunity. A lot of, especially when you know that many other parts of the world are facing an issue of an aging population. And so to harness this opportunity, we have to kind of think hard about the ways through which this very young population can achieve its full potential by being healthy and obtaining as much education as they want. And so that's in part what I'm going to talk about today. Now, the reason why the continent is so young is because it's not yet kind of like completed its fertility transition. So what we mean by fertility transition is the fact that as the mortality rate goes down, the fertility rate tends to also go down. So there is for a while, the mortality rate is low and the fertility rate is high, and so the population grows rapidly, and then the fertility rate adjusts, and then the population stops rising so rapidly. So as you can see from this chart, in most areas of the world, the fertility rate has declined quite substantially. Sub-Saharan Africa is a part of the world where it's still not declining as much. And within Sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and it's especially West Africa where the decline has been the least pronounced. But people always often look at this type of charts and then get very worried that there's going to be this population explosion. And so I just wanted to just set things straight and mention that the population density on the continent is actually not that high. And so that's not going to be at all something that I'm going to talk about today. I'm not concerned about population density. It's still lower for most of Sub-Saharan Africa than it is in Europe, for example. Another point of note is that most of the maps we have in our head, the projections kind of distort, our understanding of the size of the continent. So I just wanted to clarify that Sub-Saharan Africa is the second largest, or rather, Africa is the second largest continent in the world. It covers 20% of the land on the planet, but hosts less than 20% of the population, just between 16 and 18% of the population. So now there's a paradox, which is that if you look at real GDP growth, it's been quite strong on the continent. This is data from 2023, and the greener you are, the greatest the growth in GDP. So GDP is a gross domestic product, is a metric that economists use to think about how, what's the total wealth of a country. And as you can see, Africa is more green than a lot of other parts of the world, and so it means that there is more growth there than in other parts of the world. Okay, so they start from a lower base, but they are growing faster, which means that if you were to invest money, it could grow, in expectation at this higher rate. And so in economics, we have models that say that the money should go where the returns are the highest. The money should go where the growth is the highest. And so the paradox here is that even though Africa has been growing many countries in Africa have been growing at a relatively high rate compared to the rest of the world, if you look at FDI inflows, so what FDI is foreign direct investment, is the extent to which investors from other countries are going to invest on the African continent, it is very, very low. Okay, these bar charts just speak for themselves. It's very small amounts of FDI, only 50 billion USD in 22. Right around 50 in either 2022 or 2023, even though I mentioned that it's 20% of the land area and 18% of the population, but much less than that in share of FDI. And given that that's where the growth is the highest, we should expect more. Now you may say, well, maybe it is just 2023, maybe it's post-COVID, we don't know what's going on, investors are scared. Well, if we look at what was going on before COVID, exactly the same picture. Okay, it was relatively high growth rates on the continent and very, very little FDI. So the money is not going where economic theory tells us it should go. It's not just the money that's not flowing; it's also people. People don't seem to be interested in going on vacation on the Sub-Saharan African continent. There are just very, very few tourists going, even though tourists can be a great opportunity for a country to bring income and a source of additional growth. So, and that's just to entice you to take your next vacation on the continent. Cape Town, in my view, is the most beautiful city in the world. You can go river rafting in Uganda, climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Beautiful markets in Zambia. These are just very few examples. I wanted to put a picture of Senegal, where I was just recently on vacation with my daughter, but then I changed phone in the meantime, so I couldn't find it. Just if you've not considered that as a tourist destination, I encourage you to look at all these beautiful opportunities on the continent and think about it. But so why are tourist and foreign direct investment not flowing to Africa? Because these would be opportunities for growth. Well, the infrastructure can be lacking. So still in many contexts on the continent, you're going to have very high energy costs. Slow internet, too few roads. So that's going to be a challenge. Low human capital. So what we call human capital in economics is essentially the health and the education, the skills that are embodied in individuals. And it's relatively low on the continent with not enough youth having acquired the types of skills that are sought after on the labor market, and a disease burden that also keeps people sick too much. And to some extent, low institutional capacity. Again, it depends, on the country. It's not, the same everywhere. But there are a number of pockets of political instability, weak security and judicial systems, what we generally call relatively poor rule of law, that can also deter people from going. So, these are just some other maps to illustrate some of the points I've made. This is the share of the population with access to electricity in 2021. The subcontinent really stands out as having much lower access than everywhere else, pretty much. This is the share of the population using the internet, also much lower. This is, mobile phone subscription. That's not as striking the contrast, because actually, to some extent, the continent has been kind of like pioneer in certain aspects on mobile money and things like that. This is, having access to safely, using safely managed drinking water. That means essentially having access to water that's chlorinated, and that's very low for most of the continent. There's also a lack of data in many places, so that's another form of poverty, if you will, when we don't even have the measurements to know what's going on. As a result, the child mortality rate remains quite high in a number of countries, and again, the subcontinent is clearly seen on this map, and relatively low rates of employment or educational participation among youth. So, given this, I'm going to try to, even though I know this is a forum on contemporary issues, I think it's impossible to think through these issues if we don't first start by trying to understand the root causes and go back to, essentially a lot of history to understand these things. And so I'm going to first talk about the root causes for the poor physical, human, and institutional capital stocks in the subcontinent today. Essentially we are going to talk about the history and also the geography. And I'm hoping from that to make the point that the challenges on the subcontinent are not just the challenges of the subcontinent. There are challenges that the entire planet should take head on, and that's a moral imperative. And so it's going to be easier for me then to talk about what we can do when it comes to boosting human capital, because that's kind of like an easier nut to crack than the other two. So I mentioned, the poor infrastructure and the low institutional capacity. This is, an area where economists in particular are not particularly useful. I'm not a political scientist. There's also a lot of geopolitics involved at times, so that's not my area of expertise. Until some progress is made on that front, it may be tricky to get the infrastructure piece going, although that's something we can debate, what should come first. But where I think a lot of work has happened and where development economists have contributed and where I can speak with some expertise about what we know works and what types of policies could be put in place to make a big difference is on human capital. Okay, so when we get to talk about how to address these things, I'm going to share findings from two decades of active research on this topic, and show you that there is a lot of stuff that can be done that can be very very effective. So the root causes, I'm going to talk about the geography and also about the history. I'm hoping that this is a recap for many of you, but I think it's never too much to recap these things. So on the geography to start, there is an influential paper from a while back by two economists called David Bloom and Jeff Sachs, in which they wrote, "At the root of Africa's poverty lies its extraordinarily disadvantageous geography, which has helped to shape its societies and its interactions with the rest of the world." And they go on to explain that Africa's geography has put it at a disadvantage in three major ways. Number one, because of the very high disease burden in the area. the low agricultural potential, and very high transportation costs. Okay? So let me just say a few words about this. The high disease burden is in part because there's a lot of tropical diseases that just happen to, diseases that just thrive in the tropics, and there are more diseases like that than outside of the tropics. So there's just like a bigger disease burden to start with. And then the extent of R&D that has been going on to fight these diseases has been somewhat low, because if the people who would benefit from the medicine or the vaccines are, not very rich and not able to pay, then there's not that much incentive for pharmaceutical companies to try to push on that. Okay, so there is, so it's called neglected tropical diseases. Okay. One very famous one is malaria. Malaria still kills a lot of people, and almost 90% of all malaria deaths are on the subcontinent. And it's important to know that there was malaria in many other parts of the world historically, but the kind of intensity with which the malaria parasite is present depends a lot on the geographical features. And as of 1900, it was this is the map that was put together, estimating where it was more endemic, and the darker the red, the more active, if you will, the parasite was. So it's always been that the subcontinent was more at a deficit. But there were some other tropical areas that were also badly affected. But then it's important to keep in mind that not all malaria parasite is equal. There are two main types. There's the falciparum and there's the vivax. Falciparum is particularly deadly. Vivax much less so. So even if there was malaria in the Americas and in Southeast Asia, it was a vivax type, which is not as bad. It's bad, but not as bad. And Sub-Saharan Africa is really hit by Salmonella falciparum, which is really, really bad and causes a lot of mortality. So this is one example of a disease that disproportionately affects the continent. There are some things that are very specific to the continent. The tsetse fly, for example, it only exists on the continent, and it transmits a disease that's not fatal for humans, but it makes you sick, and it's lethal for livestock, and so it makes it very hard also to have to use animal traction, which is also generating some deficits of opportunities for the continent. Low agricultural potential. Well, as you know, Africa is kind of positioned squarely astride the equator, and so much of the continent lies in latitudes that are far from maritime sources of precipitation, and where the global climatic condition creates very arid conditions. Okay, so there's about the Sahara and the Kalahari Desert, but which cover quite a big mass on the continent. But if you look at the underlying potential, just looking at the underlying soil, the FAO estimates that some areas can be very productive, for crop and pasture. That's the dark green. So most of Europe or North America is in that category. But some other areas are like only suitable for forestry crops or permanent pastures, or just for grazing. And the worst is this predominantly unproductive land, which is the orange, which makes for quite a large part of the continent. So that's one thing that to start with, the conditions are pretty hard to grow stuff, and then on top of it is so different, if you will, the condition than from other parts of the world, that you can't have that much technological transfer. So when Monsanto comes up with a great thing to boost productivity of a Minnesota farmer, it's not going to be at all useful for a farmer in Burkina Faso. They won't be able to adapt that technology in any way. Okay, whereas most other parts of the world, as it has been shown by research, have less of a gap in terms of their agroclimatic conditions from the countries at the frontier of research, if you will. And so it's easier for those countries to benefit from spillovers than it is for the African continent. Okay? So yeah, this statistics is useful. 72% of rain-fed land area in Sub-Saharan Africa faces constraints on crop production compared to 42% in South Asia, and much less in North America. Now, unfortunately, these two things I mentioned, the disease burden and the low agricultural production potential, are going to get worse and are getting worse because of climate change. And as you know, it's the most unjust situation because the citizens of higher income countries, and especially rich citizens from higher income countries, are mostly responsible for the emissions that cause global warming, but it's the citizens, and especially the poor citizens of lower income countries, that are disproportionately hurt by global warming. So the best way to illustrate this with numbers is this, here this chart showing that the top 10% of emitters are responsible for 45% of the world emissions. Okay, and you can see here that well, actually, Africa is not even here. No, I guess this is this must be Sub-Saharan Africa and not just South Africa. If it were just South Africa, it would mean that the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa is too small to even show up. So let's even assume this is the entire Sub-Saharan African continent. It's only 2% of emissions. I mentioned before is 20% of the land area and 80% of the world population. Okay. North America is responsible for 40% of world emission. That's when you take into consideration the consumption, not just the production. So it's not like 40% of the emissions happen on American soil. That's 40% of the emission that correspond to things that are produced or consumed, that are consumed by Americans. Okay? So if I look at this CO2 emissions not based on consumption but just on production, China would have a much bigger share because a lot of what's produced in China is consumed outside of China. Okay? But it's not quite fair to say China is responsible for a lot of the emissions when in fact they are just producing a lot of stuff that other people are consuming. So I think it's interesting to look at CO2 emissions based on consumption instead. Now when you look at who is hurt, this map tells you about the change in GDP per capita that's expected by year 2100 compared to a world without climate change. Okay, so obviously this is models that take into consideration, more or less pessimistic scenarios, so you can have confidence intervals around these numbers. But you can see that again, tropical areas will be the most hurt by climate change, and we're talking about very potentially very large negative losses, and more so than in the U.S. For example, and even within the U.S., we have the same color for the whole country. But actually, if you are from Minnesota, in anything, things will get better thanks to climate change in terms of fewer extreme cold days, in terms of even production. Okay, so that's really the challenge: is that not everybody is hurt the same way by climate change, and those who are hurt the most are not those who are responsible for it. So this is the estimated climate change impact on mortality over the next, between 2040 and 2059. And I mentioned, in some areas it's going to be a negative number, so less mortality because of less cold, essentially. And then in especially the Sahel area is going to become much greater. And why is it the case that even if it's like a same amount of a degree increase, you would see more consequences on mortality in some countries? It's because depending on where you are, if you start being in a mostly brown economy, where a lot of hard work has to happen, a lot of work outside, reliance on agriculture, and less access to mitigating technology like AC, then a given rise in temperature is going to mean different consequences in terms of health. Now, the last way through which the geography is really bad is the very high transport costs. And so here I'm just going to, again, put this map. 28% of Sub-Saharan Africa, the population of 28% of the population of Sub-Saharan Africa lives in a landlocked country. So landlocked means that you don't have any sea around you. Okay, so 28% of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa is landlocked, whereas for the world it's 7%. Okay? So why is it bad to be landlocked? Well, because a lot of the activity, the economic activity, happens through shipping stuff. Okay? Shipping is way cheaper than any other way to transport goods. And even if you don't have a sea, you could say, well, it's fine, as long as I have a river, I can make it to the sea. But then the other really sad things about the continent geography is that the rivers are not navigable. So the main rivers are here. You have the Nile, you have the Congo River. They are not navigable very much, in the sense that there are many, many cataracts, many, many waterfalls all along. So this Congo River, which in principle is like beautiful and goes all through the country, like, oh, you'll be amazing. We just like put stuff here and it goes all the way to the ocean. Well, except that you have like waterfall after waterfall after waterfall. So you can't actually use that for shipping, because you can't just have your containers on a cargo ship and then you get to the waterfall and like, okay, guys, everything out. Let's walk down. And then, no, that's just not happening, okay? And historians have estimated that the cost of transport by ship, not by ship, by ship, sorry, the boats, not the animal. I can never pronounce that right. That essentially maritime transport was like 15 times cheaper than through roads. Okay, so another metric that you so besides the river not being navigable and the countries being landlocked, the ratio of seacoast line to landmass is also very, 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 very low. So you have only 1.15 meter of coastline per kilometer square of land mass, of land area, okay, in the continent, compared to over 15 in Western Europe. Okay, so it's just like that's just in Europe you have all of these. I mean, you can see it up there, but you're like, even when you have like much more, all these crannies and nooks, and it's much easier to bring stuff to various parts of the countries through water than this continent. Okay, so it's just it just makes it very hard to transport stuff and to even participate into the world economy with a lot of exports. It's just because of these high transport costs, much harder for the continent. And in fact, we'll get to the history in a minute, but this is already alluding to some of it. This is a quote from someone from the British colonial administration in 1925, saying how it would be crazy to even try to build roads. Okay, and because the problem that I just mentioned of having not very much opportunities for water transport was exacerbated by the legacy of colonialism, because the transport systems put in place by the colonial powers were really just designed to export natural resources and completely ignored interregional transportation and communications for the local population. So to this day, it's quite difficult for farmers to get their products to cities and markets if you don't have adequate roads. And so there was a dearth of investment in roads. And so this quote just says, it would be crazy to try to do roads. It would be so hard to maintain. And essentially, they believe that it was not even enough population density on the continent to make it worth it to invest in roads. So let's, this is a segue to the history part. In addition to this kind of disadvantaged geography, as you know, the continent has been afflicted by two successive and overlapping terrible episodes. The first being the slave trade. This is a picture I took from in Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, one of the castles where slaves were held before they would be put on ships. This is called the Door of No Return, that they would walk through to get on a ship, not knowing where they were being taken. And then under colonial rule, there was what's known as a scramble for Africa, where essentially the Brits and the French and the Portuguese and a few others were like, okay, let's just split this cake. And they did so, sometimes not having set foot in some of these parts of some parts of the continent, and created, countries kind of like putting together some local ethnic groups that may not have, chosen to want to be in a country together if they had been asked what they wanted to do. So this is also a picture of a very, powerful quote from the Cape Coast Castle. It says, "In everlasting memory of the anguish of our ancestors, may those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetrate such injustice against humanity. We, the living, vow to uphold this." So the slave trade has, to this day, left some imprints on the potential for the continents, because a lot of the slave trade happened through, warfare and raiding and kidnapping and pitting against each other, various ethnic groups. Okay, so the level of trust that people have now is, on average, lower. So there are some studies that have looked at, the consequences of exposure to the slave trade on today's development, mapping, across countries in the subcontinent, those that were more affected by slave trade, in the sense that there were more people taken forcibly, and finding that those countries that were more affected by the slave trade, between 1500 and 1900, to this day, have lower growth. Okay, and the mechanism is from this essentially complete destruction of the trust that people can have with each other. And a lot of the activity we do in the economic activity we do relies on trust, because if I don't trust that you're going to come and pay me for my service, when I'm fixing your car, I'm not going to fix your car if you don't give me the money first. But then, you may not have the money to give me if the person who is going to pay you for your service is also waiting. I mean, so trust is such an important component of a lot of the activities that we do, that without that it's much harder. Cooperation is also another thing that's very important. And so if you destroy the ability of people to trust and cooperate, it can take a long time to rebuild. And then on top of this, a lot of this ethnic group that were essentially pitted against each other during the slave trade were then suddenly lumped together. And so these red here are the national borders that the colonizers in their scramble for Africa decided to draw on maps. And you can see some of them are just straight lines, because they were literally just drawing a straight line on the map. And they cut across ethnic groups. So the black boundaries are the rough estimated boundaries of traditional homelands. That's from the Murdoch's map, which is arguably very approximative, but still it gives you a sense that many of these ethnic groups were just fractionalized between different countries. And so not only you split people who belong together into different countries, but then you force them to cohabit with other groups after having somewhat destroyed the trust. So that also made things complicated. Where do we go from there? So this is not fun stuff to go through, but this is the reality that this. I mean, I guess I should add something, which is that how did the colonizers did not want to settle in most of the continents because of the disease burden. Sometimes they tried, but very quickly they realized, no, it's not great here. There's malaria, there's dengue, there's all that stuff. So they didn't settle. They just wanted to, except in a few, there were a few settlers in the southern part, the less tropical part, but otherwise they mostly did not settle. So how do you extract as much as you can from a country when you don't have that much presence on the ground? Essentially, they build primarily what's called extractive institutions. So there's a lot of research on this and showing that this institution that you build are very extractive in the sense that you will try to keep the masses, disempowered and uneducated. It also takes a long time to build from that. Okay, so most of the countries now, the contemporary national boundaries became independent relatively recently in the 60s. So most of these countries are, in some sense, just about 60 years old, maybe 70 years old, and that's not very long, 60 or 70 years, to build a set of institutions that are going to be good, if you will, when you start from such a skewed set of institutions. Okay, so essentially it takes time to, I'm French originally, and when the French did the revolution, it took about 200 years. Maybe not 200, 150 for things to work out. We went back to the monarchy, and then an empire, and then the monarchy again, and an empire again. So it just takes a very long time. I think when the U.S. was just about 60 years old after independence, there was a civil war. Okay, so maybe 60 years is not that long, and that we should not expect institutions to immediately become perfect when the country started with such a bad endowment from history. So thinking about the future, what should happen if the world were just and rational, is that first we would fix the environment, because I just mentioned this very high disease burden and climate change making things worse. So, what I think should happen from a moral standpoint is that there should be a massive influx of funds from high-income countries to low-income countries to fund climate change mitigation in low and middle-income countries, and a massive influx of R&D and funding for neglected diseases to just fix the environment and reduce the disease burden. Okay, now this one, why do I say it's mutually beneficial trade between high and low-income countries to fund climate change mitigation in low-income countries is because the atmospheric CO2 decreases by the same amount whether we reduce emissions in the US or in Uganda. Okay, and it's actually much cheaper to build green than to retrofit. So if you can have a much bigger impact on for a given dollar spent today, you have a much bigger impact, if you will, if you use it to build green and to make sure that low-income countries have the means to kind of leapfrog and not go through, the fossil fuels and all of that we've been doing here, than trying to retrofit here. Ideally you do both, but if you have only $1 to spend, you won't actually spend it in low-income countries. Okay. You can also do payment for ecosystems, which is to make sure that the Amazon forest is not destroyed. We should just pay people who live near the Amazon forest and say, don't cut the trees. We know you need the trees to be able to make money, that's your living, but we don't want you to cut the trees, so we're going to pay you to maintain the trees. Okay? And that's the right thing to do, and that's actually a relatively cheap way to help the environment. And also land and labor are less expensive in low-income countries, so to find space and people to build green is going to be cheaper there. Okay, so that's actually something that economists all agree on, that it would make a lot of sense to invest in climate change mitigation in low and middle income countries. But the problem, I think, is that people say, great, then let's do this, and let's call this aid. So let's stop sending development funds and just fund this. But this is not aid. This is aiding the North, as much as the South, if you will. So we still need to have development assistance on top of that. But that's not charity, as I said in an interview earlier today with Georgia. That's not charity, that's like reparations. We need essentially massive ramp up in funding for adaptation because the best protection against climate change is income, okay? So the best way to make sure that the poor in poor countries are not massively hit by climate change the way I showed you on this map is to make sure that they are not poor before things become really hot and the rainfall becomes really erratic, okay? If we make sure that we eradicate poverty essentially, and they can have AC, okay, it's not great if, AC is not great if it's using fossil fuel, but if it's using green energy, then that's fine. But if they don't have AC, it's going to be really bad, okay? And then I'm going to argue, and I know this is not something that most people think about or like to, or say, but I think we should open the borders. I think removing barriers to labor mobility would considerably increase the world's GDP, and that's something that a researcher called Michael Clemens has shown in a paper that's now over 10 years old. That's very, very well done and very convincing, called Economics and Immigration: $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. And why does he say that immigration and letting people move would increase the world GDP by trillions of dollars? Is because when you take somebody who is in a country where the situation is such that they cannot be productive, and you move them to a country where they can be productive, they're more productive. Okay? The same way if I took one of you and all your brilliance, and I put you right now in South Sudan, you would not be as productive as you are now. Okay? And so that's kind of the point that also has been made very well in this Foreign Policy magazine of 2019 by Brian Kaplan. It says, to see this massive missed opportunity, consider the migration of a low-skilled Haitian from Port-au-Prince to Miami. In Haiti, he would earn about $1,000 per year. In Miami, he could easily earn $25,000 per year. How is such upward mobility possible? Simply put, human beings are much more productive in Florida than in Haiti, thanks to better government policies, better management, better technology, and much more. The main reason Haitians suffer in poverty is not because they are from Haiti, but because they are in Haiti. If you were stuck in Haiti, you too would probably be destitute. And then from what I talked about before, the reason why Haiti is doing so badly, there are many of them, and some of them are idiosyncratic to Haiti. But Haiti was the very first country to become independent very early on, and they were essentially a pariah because all the other countries that were the colonizers were like, we don't want to talk to you because we don't want our other colonies to do the same. And so it was pretty hard for Haiti when it became independent to be treated as a nation state, and then there were a string of terrible dictators. But it's also important to know that Haiti was during colonization, so before its independence, the soil management was terrible because it was like the French were doing a lot of extraction and plantation and can essentially cut all the trees, and so now there is complete soil erosion. So when there is when there is a hurricane, Haiti floods like crazy. Versus the Dominican Republic, which is in the same island, is fine because they have much more trees to retain the soil. So there's a mixture of, history and then, bad draws in the distribution of leadership. But it's definitely not the fault of a child being born in Haiti that they won't be having the opportunity to be productive if they stay there. So. Another quote from Brian Kaplan, the central function of existing immigration laws is to prevent this wealth creation from happening, to trap human talent in low productivity countries. So that's where I think we can all do the veil of ignorance experiment and ask ourselves, well, behind the veil of ignorance, if we were back in our mother's womb and had the choice, had to say, which country would we want to be born under the, if we didn't know which country we were going to be born in, would we want the policy to be open borders? That's a question for you to think about. Okay, so now that's what should happen, okay, in my view. Now what can happen, more realistically, I think we know, and governments can, I can see my talk is not popular because people are leaving the room despite very clear instruction that you're not supposed to. That's okay. What countries can do, and what international community can help, achieve is boost human capital, and by that I mean health and education, because we can, actually the whole world is going to also, be very happy to have a lot of young people able to, do a lot of the work that's needed. But if they are healthy and well educated, it's going to be even better. So on that, there's a lot of low-hanging fruits because there are a lot of highly effective and cost-effective intervention things that we know can immediately increase people's health and education level. And that's in part because a lot of research has happened on this topic recently. So I'll share that with you. But obviously, it has a cost, even if it can be done relatively cheaply. It does require some cost, and so, there is a massive debt crisis after COVID. So debt relief is something to also think about. Ramp up in development assistance, I mentioned that before. Access to concessionary loans are going to be necessary for governments to be able to put in place, additional things to progress on this. Okay. So now, when I say that we have evidence-based policies that can be put in place and that would have pretty rapid effects, what do I mean by that? I mean programs and policies that have been tested, and many of them in the last 20, 30 years have been tested through randomized controlled trials, which is what a bunch of us in Dominica have been doing. And a couple of years ago, some of our colleagues in this field, who've been the pioneers, won a Nobel Prize for this. It's a very simple idea. The same way to know if a vaccine works or not. You have a treatment, people to whom you give the vaccine, and you have a placebo group who gets not the vaccine but some placebo, and then you look over time. Those who got the vaccine, are they healthier? Or you can do the same with social programs. You say, well, does it increase educational attainment if you reduce the cost of education? Well, you can do that in some schools and not some others, and see does it make a difference, okay? And then very quickly you realize it makes a difference, so then you can do it in all the schools, okay? So we've been doing a bunch of these studies. So let me go over a few things that we've learned in the health sector, what I call the low-hanging fruits, because these are things that are really, really easy to do. One, we know that making vaccines, antimalarial bed nets, water treatment solutions, ORS kits free and easily accessible is going to lead to massive gains in health. And so it's already been done. Now, antimalarial bed nets are given for free to pregnant women in most of sub-Saharan Africa when they go for prenatal care. Vaccines, to a great extent, are available. But more can be done. There are people who are still in very remote areas. They have less access to healthcare, and so making sure that we solve that kind of last mile issue is going to be important. And it's been shown to be highly cost effective and very cheap per capita. Free and easily accessible primary care, especially maternal and child health, is very important. You can also get a lot of mileage from using schools as your delivery point. So in areas where you have parasitic infections or worms, you can do deworming through schools. You can provide extra nutrients in schools. You can provide HIV education through schools. That's a very effective way to deliver programs because the kids are there. And then a lot of these things were the focus of the Millennium Development Goals and led to substantial improvements. Okay? One of the areas where my own research contributed a little bit was on trying to think about whether when you subsidize health products, it's okay to make them completely free. There was a lot of resistance for a while against the idea of making things completely free because it was like, no, but it's better if you ask people to cost share, to participate a little bit, to pay a little bit, because if they are willing to pay a little bit, that means that they are more interested. You need to have your skin in the game, if you will. And if you're not willing to pay anything for a product, then maybe that means that you're not going to be willing to put the effort for it. There is also some idea that the act of paying made you more likely to want to use a product. Anyway, there are all sorts of arguments against, but also some arguments in favor. There was a big debate in particular, for bednets, should it be free? Water treatment, should it be free? And so, collectively with many other researchers, we've done a number of studies where we tried, what happens if the price is $0.50 or $1 or $1.50 or $2, And so that's what I mean by a randomized control trial. You expose, different households have the chance to pay a different price, and systematically we find that when the price is zero, I guess it's truncated here on my graph, so you don't see the top. But when the price is zero, so it's a full subsidy, everybody has access to the product. But as soon as the price increases, the demand goes down. So that's not very surprising. For those of you who've done Econ 1, we know that the demand goes down when the price goes up. But it was striking me that it is quite rapid, so you don't need to charge very much for people to not be able to pay. And so the key question was then, okay, but if people take it home when it's free, be it a bed net, a soap, vitamins, all sorts of stuff that can help, that we consider preventative health products. You may wonder why sleepers are preventative health products. Is because if kids wear sleepers, it prevents infection with parasitic worms that they can get from being barefoot. But then, this research also shown that people are just as likely to use free products as they are to use products that they paid for. And so, if you make it free, everybody has it, and then they are as likely to use them than if they have to pay. But when they have to pay, very few people can actually afford it, so they just don't have it. Okay, so there were a lot of research behind this. I'm just going over very quickly, but this debate has kind of been resolved. And the main policy recommendations from all of this is that there's no reason not to subsidize user fees for key health products, and go all the way to zero whenever possible. And in fact, there's even some studies that show that sometimes you want to go beyond zero. You want to pay people to do the right thing. Okay? And after COVID, it's a much more intuitive thing that we can think about than if some people are very reticent to, let's say, getting vaccinated and then creating potential negative externalities onto their neighbors. Maybe you say, hey, I'm going to pay you $10 if you get vaccinated. And that way they are willing to get vaccinated, and it benefits the society. Okay? So this idea that you can not only subsidize all the way to zero, but even sometimes pay people to do the right thing when you have these social externalities is also important to keep in mind. So this is a map showing that there was a massive increase in coverage of antimalarial bed nets on the subcontinent between 2000 and 2015, and the mortality rate has declined over the same time period. Okay, so overall, significant health gains in the past 25 years. But more is needed. So this is showing you the child mortality rate in sub-Saharan Africa has declined from 150 to 70 children dying per 1,000 births. But it's still, still higher than in South Asia, and obviously much higher than in high-income countries. The maternal mortality is where the progress has been a bit slower, and still much more can be done. So, there's been progress, but more can be done, and we know of a lot of policies that can be put in place to make this difference. It's more a matter of finding, finding the money, if you will. That's the challenge. The not so low hanging fruits, nuts that are slightly harder to crack. There are still medical deserts, areas where essentially a dearth of healthcare providers. So there is some recent work that has shown that it really makes a big difference to have a trained medical doctor. This is wonderful work by Edward Okeke in Nigeria, showing that places that get a medical doctor versus not do see decreases in child mortality. So how do we get there? Well, there is a very large young population in the subcontinent. If they could go to medical school, then they could become providers and solve that problem. So, there should be more medical schools being built on the subcontinent. Again, the issue is where are the funds going to come from? But the returns would be very high. And so, given the moral imperative that I mentioned earlier, I think these funds should come from a ramp up in development assistance. Getting a lot of medical doctors trained very quickly would take time. As you know, it takes a number of years in medical school, but in the meantime, you can have community health workers. These are like folks who are trained much faster for a year or two, but they can be, a useful second best, as we call it. They can still help, even if it's not, as it cannot solve every problem, but it can help to have at least some trained workforce. There are also some informal providers that can be trained, and then financial incentives for providers. There's a lot of research that have shown that it can also improve performance. Health insurance is something where there's a lot of work going on right now. A lot of governments are setting up a public health insurance scheme. Rwanda has one. Ghana has had one for a long time. Côte d'Ivoire is setting up something where they try to have universal medical coverage. And there are, as we know, health insurance is complicated. The US is definitely not at the frontier on that. So it's not easy, but it's an area with a lot of movement and a lot of potential as well. And then, solving the R&D issue for drugs and vaccines for neglected topics is going to be very important, and for that there is a mechanism called an advanced market commitment mechanism designed in part by one of my collaborators, Michael Kremer, one of the Nobel Prize winner of 2019, which is to say that if you guarantee the pharmaceutical companies a given demand, let's say if you find a vaccine for this disease, we guarantee that so many doses are going to be purchased at that price, okay? Then it can create incentives for the pharmaceutical companies to do the R&D. Okay? And so it's the international community kind of like backing out and saying, we guarantee there will be this demand, okay, at this price. Because otherwise, if you don't have that guarantee, if I develop a vaccine for something that no one can really pay for, but let's say the government of a country says, no, I promise I'll pay for that. Once I've sunk the cost as an R&D as a pharma firm, and I've come up with a product, and I go to you and I say, okay, you asked me to do this, I've done it. They're like, okay, great, actually we're going to pay you a tenth of what we promised. And that's, what can you do? You've sunk the R&D cost. You can't, how do you deal with this reneging? So you need a guarantee that's backed by essentially funds being put in a. But so that's a beautiful, this advanced market commitment. That's a beautiful innovation that could be put in place for many neglected diseases, and it's not been picked up as much as it should have. So I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly on education. But in education, we also know a lot of, essentially very impactful policies. So this is a study we did in Kenya where we subsidized uniforms. School had become free already at the primary level, but it turned out that for girls, for boys and girls, sometimes the cost of the uniform was still a problem, and the uniforms were mandatory. So we just gave free uniforms to some kids, and again, some schools got free uniforms, some schools did not, and we compared over time, and we find that if you get the free uniforms, it reduces the dropout rate, and it reduced unintended pregnancy among teenage girls. Okay, so this was one type of program. Then in Ghana, we've been doing a project for the past 15 years looking at the impact of scholarship for secondary school. So many countries still charge quite large tuition for secondary school. So in Ghana, this was back in 2008. It was not free at the time, and we gave scholarships to 700 young, right around 700 youth. And we found that this really increased the likelihood that they were able to complete secondary school. It also reduced the likelihood of an unwanted first pregnancy, and down the road increased the likelihood that they were formally employed. And now we even have a follow-up study where we find that the very women who got a scholarship 15 years ago are less likely to have had a child who passed away before the age of 3, and that their children have a higher level of cognitive development by the age of 5 and 7, because they've been better able to invest in the health of their children, thanks to the greater education that they've been able to have. So this is just saying, make school completely free, remove the cost of the uniform, remove the tuition, and people get access to more education, and that just make them thrive more. Another policy that's been very common in some other parts of the world and are only starting to emerge in Sub-Saharan Africa is cash transfers. So this is just like giving cash to families who have children of school age. And very often they are conditional transfers, so it's conditional on the kids showing up to school every day. It turns out that making it conditional is not that big of a deal, even if you don't check that they show up in school. It still makes a difference, and it's easier for the families to keep their kids going to school. It leads to higher schooling, delays in marriage and childbearing for girls. So this is a very very effective type of policies, but still few governments in Sub-Saharan Africa have the resources to do that at scale. So that's another thing that could be funded with additional resources. This is an example in Malawi showing the rate of marriage went from 18% to 10% when people get an unconditional cash transfer. Okay, and this is about girls' agency. There are some contexts, some families where maybe the girl wants to go to school, but the parents are like, well, we're not too sure it's worth the investment. This is a program that taught girls how to negotiate better with their parents, how to convince their parents. Just, my experience with my own teenage daughter, that she doesn't need anybody to tell her how to negotiate. She's doing a pretty fine job on her own, getting what she wants. But maybe because she's been watching too much TV. But in this context, it seems like helping girls negotiate better with their parents was one way to increase their ability to be kept in school for longer. So some of the programs require funding just directly to the household. Some of them can be about changing also the content of education in lower levels of schooling, so that it empowers students to do better later on. And then last point on this, linking health to education. Health is very important. If you're not healthy to start with, your ability to take advantage of the education that you can obtain is going to be lower. And so in particular, there's this famous study by Kramer et al. That shows that if you treat kids for intestinal worms, this is a context in Western Kenya where there was a lot of infection with parasitic worms, then the absenteeism goes down. And when absenteeism goes down, which means that I'm not sick as much, I can go to school more, I learn more, and that has longer term effects on your success in the labor market. So there's been a lot of progress in education. Again, a lot of these studies that have been done have also led to policy changes. So there's been gains in education with a greater share of kids completing primary school, and gender parity also increasing somewhat, and getting closer to 1, at least at the primary level. But the next steps will be to think more about early childhood development and making sure that every kid has access to school earlier than 6 or 7, which has been shown to be quite influential as well. And then greater investment in secondary schooling, so that not only those who get a scholarship, but everyone can get access to free secondary education. So I knew I was going to run out of time and not have time for concluding remarks, so I didn't put anything on the slide. I'm hoping that you will conclude for me. I'm not going to call on someone and ask to do a summary because I know that you may have been distracted and looked at your phone instead. But hopefully the Q&A can serve as concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
So it is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, we ask that you raise your hand and wait until a microphone reaches you before you ask your question. We reserve the first questions for students, and then after that, we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. And with that, we are looking for our first question.
Hello. Just kind of a general question about the possibility of remittances and the impact that they could have on, that kind of starting up that cycle of foreign direct investment, or if that is, not quite as sustainable comparatively.
So I didn't hear the first part. You mean the impact of what?
The impact of remittances versus
remittances.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I actually cut out the slide where I had already too many maps, but indeed, remittances are very big. Are very big. Okay. And that's another reason why my open border policy is not crazy, because most people would not actually migrate, and people who would send a lot of remittances back, and even more so it would build from that. So there is a lot of remittances, and people use them to invest in small businesses and build houses and do stuff, but it's not of the scale of it's not about it's not enough to, let's say, creating a whole garment industry so that all of the Nikes and H&M of the world would then be able to source from those countries, right? So it's like the scale is just like too small. But remittances are a huge deal and a huge source of income, but it's more for consumption.
I think the precious metals mining industry plays a substantial role in kind of perpetuating the problems you mentioned up here, just like low wages, child labor, injury and death at work, and all the above.
Sorry, you're speaking too fast, and the light was in my.
I'm sorry. Do you think the precious metals mining industry plays a substantial role in kind of perpetuating the problems you mentioned above, like low wages, child labor, and injury and death at work and whatnot?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. There is a number of countries on the subcontinent that have amazing minerals, diamonds and cobalt. It's a big deal in the Congo, and it's super useful nowadays for a lot of our technologies. That's goes back to the discussion of the extractive institutions. A lot of the countries have essentially granted extraction rights to private firms for 100 years or something like that. And so the local population does not at all benefit from all the revenue that is being generated by these minerals. And so why is that? Well, a lot of it is the poor governance aspect, where the leader of the country may not be a democratically elected leader, or even if they are democratically elected, they go astray and realize that they can make a lot of money by accepting a big, bribe from the private firms. So the incentives are not quite right for the leaders to not end up selling these rights to other firms. And so I think there could be room for much more regulation around that in some sense. Maybe you could say, well, it's not okay for a US firm to buy such rights, for example. And in principle, they're not supposed to pay bribes. There is international regulations around bribes, but obviously it's very hard to enforce. And then in terms of the local population, I mean, a job is better than no job. So when you think about child labor, it's a little bit of a complicated topic because, in an environment where the resources are very limited, if I have a choice between not having food on the table versus working as a child and having food on the table, as a child, or as, your choice may be to actually work. Okay, so I think that the agency should be given to the population to choose whether they need to send the child to work. The literature on this shows that child labor is not like greedy parents forcing their child to work. It's poor parents having no other choice. Now, it's a complicated thing because if no child was working, then maybe the adult wage would be higher. Because when you have substitutability between child labor and adult labor, a lot of children working and they keep the wages of the parents down, of the adults down. So ideally, you'd have a ban on child labor so that no child can work and the adult wage can be higher. But again, enforcement may be tricky. And if it's not well enforced, then the ban on child labor actually allows the employer to exploit further the children by saying, well, I'm not supposed to hire you. So if you really want to work for me, I'm going to pay you even less. So it's not that simple. And there is some studies that have looked at, poorly enforced bans on child labor are worse than no bans for the well-being of the children and their wages. So it's all, it's all a mess. But the bottom line is that if the resources going to the local population are very small, and they're struggling to make ends meet, then the fact that there may be child labor as an outcome isn't maybe not surprising, but it's going to be hard to reverse. So the short answer after this long answer to your question is that the minerals have had on net not a great impact because they have affected the type of institutions that are available, and people have called this like a curse, to have these resources, the resource curse. Yeah.
So I know you only touched on institutions briefly, and I know that's not necessarily your area of expertise, or you can circle back to it if I'm wrong on that. But I was wondering if you noticed in the studies if there's like a significant difference in the efficacy of programs, especially privately run ones, in countries with better versus worse institutions, and how that affects the ability to absorb funds.
Yeah, so it really depends on it depends on many things. So, a lot of development programs are run by NGOs, and then you can have heterogeneity, the quality of the management of the NGOs, and to the extent that they can work independently of the government, the quality of the institutions may not matter that much. Now, when it comes to working with governments, and so aid that goes to the let's say HIV aid going to the Ministry of Health, or then in general, yes, there is a relationship in the sense a negative one. So the worse the institution, maybe the lower the return on investment, because you can think of it as a kind of a tax. If you give $100 and the government, the institution is not great, maybe you're going to lose 10 or 20% to corruption or poor management or what have you. Okay. So you can think of this as being a glass half empty and like, oh, then it's not worth it and let's not do it. Or you can think of it like, okay, that's a price to pay, just increases. We have to, if we want $100 to be spent, we need to send 120. Okay, so that's, but where it becomes tricky, that sometimes the quality of the institutions on a map, like for example, whether it's a democracy or not, whether from the lived experience of the local population, it's a good or a bad governance, may be completely separated from the quality of the implementation or how functional things are. So an example, to put it concretely, is Rwanda. You can say Rwanda is kind of an autocracy to some extent, because Kagame has been the president now for a good number of years. But they have an extremely, super well-trained and efficient, bureaucracy. And so if you want to do a program with the Ministry of Health, it's going to be very well done. It doesn't mean that from the point of view of the people, they would say that they have freedom, political freedom, for example. So there are many dimensions of institutions, and sometimes it's not a line. What's good for one thing can be bad for another.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Do you think it would be worth? It for governments in sub-Saharan Africa to try to enact efforts to lower the fertility rate, similar, not quite as severe as the one-child policy in China, but something less severe to at least get it to a lower level? Or do you feel like it would be better for governments to embrace the potential long-term economic benefits of a higher fertility rate in the future?
So there are two parts to this question. The first, I think people should have a right to choose what they want to do. So I don't think it's anyone's business to tell me how many kids I can have. So that's number one. As a matter of principle, I think having laws on the books about what people can do is not great. And historically, when that has been done through, let's say, forced sterilization in India under the emergency under Indira Gandhi, or the one-child policy in China, it's been, I think the well-being of the population affected has been, very much affected by that, and then there are also long-run consequences in terms of, trust that people have in institutions. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that even if there were some non-coercive ways for the government to do things, then you can say, okay, we're going to, you could give a cash transfer to people who decide to be, childless. I think it's neither here nor there, because this is not, the fertility is not so much of an issue. It's more kind of like the high fertility is more a consequence than the cause of anything. And so by that, I mean that in the areas where people have access to, better health and education and economic opportunities, the fertility rate is lower. So the reason why in certain areas, let's say I've worked on fertility decisions in rural Burkina Faso, the reason why people have 6 or 7 children is because they want to have 6 and 7 children. And even if they have access to modern contraception and all the information in the world, they want to have 6 or 7 children because they need the children to cultivate the land, to have support in old age, and because it's a source of joy when you don't have internet and you can't look at TikTok and people doing videos, dances on TikTok, but you can see your kids dancing, and that's a lot of fun. So it's like, but when you have other opportunities that come, then what we know from history, looking at what has happened in the US and in Europe and in India, the fertility rate goes down. So it's not a matter of like, what can we do to change the fertility rate so that growth comes around? It's like, how we can get more activity going on, and then we just know people will have fewer children. But maybe that's, as you said, not even a good thing if people have fewer children, because then if we end up in a situation like, in Korea, where the fertility rate is 0.8 children per woman, that means that over time, humanity will be extinct, which maybe is great for the planet. Finally, we'll stop, destroying it. But it's clearly not necessarily going to be, ideal from, if we think about human welfare. So I think the whole premise that the fertility rate should be a key, parameter of interest to be manipulated is not one that I have in the back of my mind.
That concludes tonight's program. Please join me in thanking Dr. Dupas one more time for her talk tonight.
Thank you.